Hey, welcome back. What have I got for you today? Right, well, this is a scratch-built copy of the Millennium Falcon turret from the 5-foot Millennium Falcon. What I've done here is completely built this from scratch using plastic card, acrylic cutouts for the base. I've matched this directly to the screen images from the reference images, and all the gaps and all the cutouts are the same. They're all slightly wonky. Things are not quite straight on this if you look at the proper model. It's got all the original kit parts on it and it looks really nice. It's super accurate. I made the window frame from plastic card and cut acrylic pieces. That fits into this area just here. Sits quite nice. It has to be separate because it's a slightly different colour than the rest of it. It's a little bit more blue-white. I'll show you that on the references later. There's a shelf inside here for detail. I don't have the model kits for that to sit on top of that shelf at the moment, so that's removable, so I can add those at a later date when I get those kits. So, the paint job. The most tricky part of anything like this is getting the paint job accurate, because if you've got a super mega accurate part with all the kit parts on it, you know, it's not a cheap undertaking. This is a few hundred quid's worth of model kits in just this piece. You can see the construction underneath from cut perspex pieces. You can see all the layouts in plastic card separate pieces put on the inside there. The edge was cut in concentric rings, slowly growing to give the correct angle on the edge here. It's not as lazy as you would imagine. It's actually more vertical than you think, but this lens is making it look particularly vertical when you view it like that. It's not actually right. There's quite a good angle on the edge there, which matches the reference well. All these are original kit parts. Everything on it is as accurate as I can possibly make it. So that is the base model that I've spent a couple of weeks constructing. So, next thing to do with this is the paint job, the tricky part. You can make a mess of these things. I don't want it shaded, I don't want to pre-shade it, I don't want to do any of that. I want to copy exactly what I see on screen as much as I can. Important thing is colours on these, and colours are only from the reference. So, let's have a look at the references. So these are the references that I'm going to be working to. This one is a view which has the wrong gun on it. This is the bottom gun on the top turret. So we're ignoring this gun assembly. Any pictures of this that have the side supports missing and have these two little details on are from the bottom gun. So I'm not looking at this, anything to do with the reference, but I am looking at all this surrounding area here. The colour on this is a little bit too light grey. It's not got as much contrast as I want, but what it does is shows me the subtle changes of the washes on the surface. So you can see in areas like this, there is a wash on that panel, and it runs across in, there's kind of like waves in there, a little bit like curtains of paint running out over. And they change in shade from like a buff colour to a darker grey buff. Next panel along here has got about 3 different coloured washes on as far as I can tell. There's a light wash in a grey underneath this other wash, which looks to be, it's got a tinge of olive in it or something, but it's mainly a dark buff. I think it's the same shade as this wash here, but slightly darker on this panel. This panel here has a very subtle wash on it, but doesn't have the same intensity of the yellow pigment as that one there. So this one's slightly greyer. These two appear to be the same wash, and this section here, there's a wash on there that appears to run across both panels here and onto this area. So this will be done in one big wash, all the way across there. Put the paint on. Next one will be this wash here, where I'm trying to copy these edges where the paint has accumulated on the edge of the wash. And then I'll be working my way around doing all the other bits. So colour choice is pretty paramount on this. The red oxide colour on the panels with the rust is going to be a red oxide primer, just because it's a good colour, it's dark, it doesn't have the mad redness to it. The lighter shade is going to be this mix which I made for the Slave 1 red, which goes on the skirt of Slave 1. It looks very pink, but it's actually not. Comes out quite nice. That is more grey than pink when it goes on. I've also chosen this one, which is a dark yellow. I'll use that very sparingly on this. Next one I chose was buff. That's a pretty much standard issue for Star Wars weathering and what have you. Buff is the colour that gives them that really nice kind of warm feel. Don't use a lot of it. So I've got buff there. Next one, light grey. This has a fairly light blue hue to it as well. Got to be careful with that one. And then neutral grey, which is just a black and white mix, and that will be thinned according to the shade that I want. Okay. So first job is I've mixed up a couple of colours. So I've got the buff in here. This is very thin. I've diluted it dramatically with the Tamiya thinner, so it gives me this very translucent wash colour to it. This one here is just Tamiya thinners on its own, and this one is black with Tamiya thinners really diluted, so that I can change the shade of any area that I put a wash onto. So the idea is to follow the details on the surface of that model. Here's a little bit of tester. It's got the same base coat on. I'll be testing the way that these washes go on. So the idea is you get your chosen shape. We know what it's going to look like on the surface. I add just the Tamiya thinners to give me, there's a little bit of pigment in, but we don't care. Just to give that area a little bit of something. And then what I can do is move this stuff about, thin it down by wiping the brush so that it takes off some of the colour. If I find I've got an edge to a bit of a wash that I want to be darker, I can take a little part of the dark section and just pop it into the liquid, and it will just migrate to the edges and pick out the edge of that wash, and that gives us the subtle edges on the wash when it dries off, which is what I'm trying to replicate on the model itself. The more Tamiya thinners I put on, the more I can maneuver this stuff around to give me the shape that I want with the wash. And if I want to get slightly darker areas, I can just add a little bit of black to it, take it into the area that I want, and let the diffusion do the rest of it. So it's quite easy to generate the same kind of look that they have on the surface. When it's dry, it won't look quite as messy, and when all the other layers come on top of it, it'll come through quite well. But what I'm looking at here is the colour. Just making sure that that buff dark colour is what I want to use. So I'm messing around, just trying to see what gives me the effect that I want. If I run that dry brush down the middle again, it will pick it all up. And I can isolate the edges of the colour to where I want them to be. Anyway, here we go. Okay, so that's the little wash areas put on there just to give the impression of surface detailing, to match the areas that I can see on the weird washes on the model itself. So that's that stage done. All sorts of weird marks around the side, all kinds of stuff. Okay, so we've got that, and I have now repainted this with a grey primer and then a pure white primer, which gives pretty much the bluish look that I'm after. It's very, very subtle, almost pure white, but that then gives the difference between the surface base colour and the window frame colour. So that looks pretty good, all good. I've put a little bit of initial paint on this just into the recesses to pull the detail out a touch. That's going to get a load more work as we get through, and then I'm going to replace this spindle with something which is nice, not just a piece of brass. But yeah, so we're getting there. On to the next stage. There's a lot of weird marks just here that I think are Dremel marks. I can see the same kind of ball-shaped end look to those marks, so I've got to put those in. And I can't do that with paint because they're physical damage. There's a few more, like these little cuts here. Anywhere that super bright white appears is usually a Dremel. I'm not sure about these ones. They could be paint. I've got to check that. On the top here at the nose there's a load of Dremel marks, and there's some dark Dremel marks here, and all these white marks are Dremel, so they've got to be done before the next base, before the next grey colour goes over the top of that. But at the moment I'm working through this panel here, trying to get these funky shades of like a buff decking brown type arrangement that are layered on top of each other with numbers of washes. Now, it's very difficult for me to replicate the washes exactly, so once I've got the basic tone on here, I'm going to go over the top of that again with more masking fluid just to give me that super subtle shaded edge to everything, and hopefully I'll be able to get the idents looking more exact to that after that second airbrush masking pass. But at the moment I'm working on the bases with these subtle light coloured washes. There's a huge one on that panel there, you can see that. I did that one earlier. Right, so we've gone over this with the new wash layer, more with buff, just to pick out those nice tan colours on that. They've got to spread into this area here, but I'm not going to use a wash because that's got the right kind of texture to it, but these ones are different, and I can't replicate a wash perfectly just because of the randomized nature of it. So what I'm trying to do is pick out a few edges on this with latex masking fluid later, and there's Dremel action to go on this. Nearly all these white marks on this panel need Dremeling off. There's some here, there's some here, there's a couple on here. This panel here needs airbrushing just over the top to blend that together, and Dremel lines putting in and all the rest of it. And some of the panels, this one actually is fairly complex, and I've got some more stuff to do on that to bring it into this kind of arena. Not as harsh as this one, definitely way more subtle, but now I've got these black marks in, I'm going to start by just putting the blend around the black marks, slowly working towards the final look if I can. There's a load of dremeling to do on this front section here, so I think I'll probably attack the dremeling next. Just got to let that paint dry off on this panel here, and then I'm going to hit it with a Dremel.
Express yourself.
Okay, so that's a little pass with a neutral grey. I can see from the colour tone on the reference that this side is shadowed with a fairly neutral grey plus a darker grey over the top of it that has a very slight warmth to it. But on this side, the shading is done with something that has more of this tan colour in it. So from this point onwards here, these panels I'm going to shade the edges in accordance with the reference in a slightly warmer colour. Right, so we've got it to this stage now. It's looking pretty good. All the shading's pretty much there. I think the light's blowing it out a little bit on here, but it's super subtle. The camera doesn't really pick it all up. But there's a few areas that I need to address now. This section here is looking pretty good, but there's some more buff colour on there to bring it up and differentiate between that grey and this one. And it's quite heavy in the bottom here, but there's some edges to it, so I'm going to do some more liquid latex on there. The same for a couple of these other panels and some on this one here.
Express yourself. Express yourself.
Okay, so it's almost good to go now. It's very, very light colour, this turret on the 5 foot. It's not quite as contrasty as the stuff on the 32-inch Falcon. So there's a couple of little tiny edges to reveal, just to pull the detail out on there a bit. And then I am putting in the final dark colour, which goes over the top of these black marks. It's a dark grey, looks a bit like a German grey, but I'm going to go a touch blacker. And that will give me the final darkest areas on the top of this turret. There's a couple of black lines and marks to put in here, and a little bit more dremeling that I spotted. So we're getting pretty close now. Okay, so I've... Shut up. Right, so I've mixed up a little darker colour. It's not black, it's a dark grey. But that's going to go on pretty thin. Right, so I'm going to start off for a colour check along the edge of this panel here. I'm just going to feather that in. How are we looking? This area needs more here. Right, so now looking at this edge around here, there's a few little areas that are lighter than the other colour. So we're going to go darker over the top of that. This little section on the end of this is pink. So I'm going to sand that back. Through the layers a little. Just to reveal that corner. And then I'm going with a fraction bit of pink on there in a moment. There's another pink bit just over. 2 dots there. And all I'm doing to bring this pink up is just rubbing through a little bit to lighten up the density of that red on top of the grey. That should give me the right kind of look. With a little bit there. Remember to do the bit that you want and then blend it so you don't get like a little white scratchy mark and then nothing else to it. Hopefully you can see what's happening there. It's cutting through the layers and revealing that red on top of the grey, and then as I keep going it's allowing a bit more of the grey to show through and giving me a bit more of a pinky colour, which is exactly what I'm after. These definitely look like little sanding marks on the top here. almost indiscernible, but it makes a huge difference to how the surface actually looks, because they did an awful lot of this on the ILM stuff. So don't know if you can see the difference, but hey, there you go. It is what it is. Right, I'm just gonna reshape that corner. Yeah, so you can see all these panels are slightly asymmetric. They're not completely the same either side. The gaps are different. The tapers are different. This one is not parallel. These two edges are not parallel. These covers with this detail on here, they were supposed to come off and reveal two screws that held the whole gun onto the turret. I've glued them in place, there's no reason for these to come off. The two sides are not symmetrical, and they're not supposed to be, and they're not parallel on the edges. So I've taken a fair bit of time trying to get this as accurate as I possibly can. I'm very happy with the colour tone. I'm very happy with the density of this sort of buff colour around here. And all these panels, I like the way that it's grey on one side and comes to a warmer colour on this side. It's pretty faithful. I got my wash lines in pretty well. All the little details and the little striggles at the end, they're all in the right kind of place. All these subtle changes in this wash over the surface, I had to try and replicate that with airbrushing and a wash. It's got these very fine, what I can only presume are very tiny thin crack lines on the original paint job, but they're in there as well. Everything's looking pretty good. So now what I'll do is I'll spend a bit of time looking at it just to see if anything jumps out at me as being wrong, but I've got to add a few more little black bits to it.